Hi, everybody. I'm Tony. With me is Wayne, and Kelsey, and we are going to talk about Indigenous realities. Before we start, and before Wayne and Kelsey tell you who they are, where they're coming from, I'm going to start with a question. So, my question is, if a movie was made about your life, what genre would it be and who would play you?
Ooh.
Who would play you? That's the hard one. Um, let's go with Kelsey first.
Sure. I like to think of my life like kind of like a comedy.
Okay.
And you know what? I love them. And I mean, like, just a bit of a stretch of a compliment that I've got from a guy who was definitely trying to get my attention. He's like, "You look a little bit like Jessica Biel," and I was like,
Oh.
"Oh my goodness,
Oh.
I will take that. It will be Jessica Biel."
Perfect. Wayne, you're up.
I mean, it really depends what part of my life we're talking about. Sometimes it's a horror film, but I think I'm hoping it's a comedy. I'm hoping
Hoping
it's
it's
one of
comedy.
those.
Dark comedy?
Yeah, yeah. To play me, 1980s John Travolta, hopefully with a nice tan.
I um
But probably Louise Guzman, if we're being honest. And I love Louise Guzman, but probably Louise Guzman.
All right. I would hope mine would be like some sort of like sci-fi thriller, only because I can only hope that my life will go in that direction eventually. And for whatever reason, James Franco comes to mind, and I have no idea why. I think it's just because of his like he was the guy in Spring Breakers, right? He was just like really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Yeah. Why
for
would you
what
pick his worst movie? I mean, there's a lot
yeah.
of options there. And it's
Yeah, but I for whatever reason his role in that movie came to mind, and I was like, all right, I'll take it. That's what I think. So now that we've gotten that really bad part of it out of the way, um, let's talk about who you are and what you're bringing to the table in terms of what we're talking about. We're going to be talking about Indigenous realities and mental health, so mental illness and all these different things. We're going to be having a discussion. So where you're coming from and what you're bringing and what you're like, where you're speaking from. Um, Kelsey went first last time, so now you're up, Wayne.
Perfect. So my name is Wayne Robinson. I'm from Bigdagon, Anishinaabeg, First Nations. We used to be called Pick River. So we're in northern Ontario, top of Lake Superior. But that being said, I grew up as an urban Indigenous person. So I've always grown up in larger cities, lived in my community for a very small amount of time. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been working in social services with a focus in the last 10 years with the urban Indigenous community here in Montreal.
Excellent.
And I'm diagnosed bipolar
Okay.
1. So I think that also will play a lot into
Yep.
our discussion here today.
Absolutely. And Kelsey, how about you?
Yeah, Gwegwe. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey Melanson. I am also an urban Indigenous person. I'm born and raised in Scarborough, kicking it now in Montreal. I'm the tender age of 28 years old, and I have worked frontline. I have worked in post secondary. I've worked in Indigenous and non Indigenous institutions. So I have worked a lot within mental health, court systems, overall well being. And so for me, I definitely do relate to folks who do have issues with anxiety. I am someone who often struggles with anxiety as well. And so that's what I am bringing to the table today.
Excellent, excellent. So I told you guys a bit about this, and for those watching, I'm just going to start with every time I go to an event that, or at least lately, every time I go to an event, there's always a land acknowledgement that happens at the beginning of these things. Um, I personally will not be giving a land acknowledgement because I don't feel that I feel as though it just plays lip service to the Indigenous experience, and if an organization or if an institution is doing nothing else other than giving that lip service, it's an empty phrase, and it's an empty, like, it's tokenistic. There's all these words that come to mind that are just like, there's no positives behind it aside from the actual acknowledgement and like saying what you want. But it's not to acknowledge Indigenous peoples. It's more about white guilt and colonizers' guilt and appeasing that than to who it's addressing. So I just want to say that from the beginning for those who are watching and are asking why that.
And if I can add a little bit to that.
Absolutely, please.
I know maybe like 6 years ago, I was a big fan of land acknowledgements. I really pushed it, worked with a lot of organizations to develop them. And I think what we're seeing a lot right now in the Indigenous community, especially the Indigenous activist community, is this sort of moving away from those land acknowledgements. We've heard a lot of Indigenous scholars talk about how maybe they had a bit of apprehension of being a part of land acknowledgements. Because again, I think what you were saying, Tony, has been something we've seen across the board. The idea that talking about a land acknowledgement without any praxis to like actual action really becomes just an empty gesture. I mean, it's really good to know that, all three of us right now are in Jogate. All three of us are on unceded Ganagwaga lands. That's good to know. And I think that's a good process that most people should know the territory they're on. But if you're going to make a statement that acknowledges the harm and pain suffered by Indigenous peoples that isn't followed with a direct action plan of what you're doing to address those issues, again, you're just doing lip service. So thank you, Tony, for not doing a land acknowledgement.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that performative activism is pretty damaging. So I do agree.
Yeah. So and you know what? Let's start the discussion with that. So there's Indigenous realities, and there's no one reality, right? Like there's no one Indigenous life. There's no one way that Indigenous people live their lives. You have both said you're urban Indigenous people. So like this is one, and even then you both have different experiences. So and this is something that we have to acknowledge too, is that there's no one way that people live their lives. And so we can't just lump this into this one window of like, this is the Indigenous voice and these people are speaking for all Indigenous peoples and this is how it is for everyone. And so I just want to make sure that that's acknowledged from the beginning, that like you guys are giving your own experiences, and that's what we're doing with this series, is just to let people talk and get people talking. And so, go ahead.
If I can share a very quick story here,
absolutely,
and I'll try to make it brief. Yeah. It's something I talk about a lot, is this idea there is no pan-Indigenous concept. We often make a mistake of looking at North America and not seeing the same way we do in like a Eurocentric way, like Europe. Europe, a much smaller landmass, and we can easily say someone from Italy and someone from Ireland, completely different experiences, different cultures, different languages, different ways of expressing their spirituality or relationship to food. But when you look at Canada, which is like objectively 20, 30, 40 times bigger, we have this idea of pan-Indigenous concepts, like the Disneyfication of Indigenous people. So all Indigenous peoples are represented in this idea. Or we go the other way and we just look at all the barriers faced by Indigenous peoples and identify people with those barriers, which I think does nobody really any good service.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about, in terms of like mental health and mental illness and like how it affects people. We talked about the land acknowledgements being a tokenistic gesture, and it's just like playing lip service. So how does that play out in the real world? Like how as an Indigenous person, have you experienced this, and how does it affect you as being like this token person? I don't know. Like I can't really like put a phrase. So maybe Kelsey, you can go first here.
Sure. So I find this a lot in the institutions that I have been in that are non-Indigenous. There's been multiple times where, I've taken a position. I'm super happy to help. Usually it's in the line of education or training, whatever it may be. And then all of a sudden I become sort of like this person on the lower level doing doing the real work, doing the frontline work. But then I have like executive level side work of just figuring out the institution's problem with racism. And what I usually find is that institutions don't actually want to address anything that is racist, especially towards Indigenous folk. They just want to look not racist. Yeah. And that's why they have me there. And then so there's an, I won't name the institution, but it's funny. I actually did a presentation on land acknowledgements because they're like, we need a land acknowledgement, and I'm like, I don't really like. If you need it,
Yeah.
I'll talk about it, but I'm not going to make one for you.
Yeah.
And then so I did a whole presentation where I showed half the side where people were like, some people like land acknowledgements.
Yeah.
Here's why. Here's the reason why people don't like land acknowledgements. I used forgive me, I forget his first name. But he used to work for Ryerson, and he wrote their land acknowledgement, and he regrets it because it's performative activism. So this is often what happens. And for me, and talking along the lines of mental health, and sort of my anxiety is the fact that I didn't necessarily grow up Indigenous. I didn't grow up in my culture. In fact, my indigeneity was kind of whispers for most of my childhood, in the sense where like no one really wanted to talk about it because they didn't really know how to talk about it, and they didn't want me to talk about it. So um, it's odd because then all of a sudden I'm just this face. Like I feel like they should put a poster of me like this Indigenous approved. It's not true, right? It's not something that I'll do, and I feel like every time they're like, "Oh, will you make us resources?" I'm like, "No,
Yeah.
Google it."
Yeah.
Like
You do need to do the work yourself sometimes.
Absolutely, and that's how you learn. If you want to come ask me a question about something that you're thinking about or you want an opinion on, that's cool. But I'm not here to be your guide through this process that you're going through. This is your journey, so do the work.
Excellent. Wayne, how about you?
So I think really what you have to look at, and I think we'll talk about this later on, is this really sharp contrast between the Indigenous experience and Indigenous identity. Um, we don't want to challenge anybody in their identity. We all see ourselves the way we see ourselves, and you know, whether or not you grew up on the reserve, in a community, or as part of the Métis Nation, you're going to have different experiences. Like again, we said there's no pan-Indigenous concept, but there is an Indigenous experience. There's an Indigenous experience that was perpetrated on Indigenous peoples, in a Canadian context, by the government of Canada through the Indian Act, through residential schools, through the 60s scoop. And this really leads to intergenerational trauma. And I
Yeah.
don't think a lot of people know what that looks like.
Yeah.
So for somebody who is diagnosed bipolar, I mean, if I came from a more supportive community, like a family environment, would have that presented the same way? Is somebody who grew up living those effects of the trauma inflicted on our communities? Having one grandmother who went to a really horrific residential school, another grandmother who was murdered when I was very young, growing up with the poverty we grew up with, so being homeless both as a family and then later on in life at 15, I was homeless until I was almost 19.
Mhm.
These sort of like aggravated a lot of the traumas, and I think that vicarious sort of traumatic response meant that my own mental health issue might have been more amplified. It might have led to different situations and my own relationship with my identity, because of the very negative experiences I had because I was Indigenous. For a great deal of my life, I didn't want to be Indigenous. So my identity was in no way a protective factor. Instead, it became a really big risk factor.
Okay.
The fact that I was Indigenous actually created situations that added more barriers, that were more challenging to me. So I think identity, experience are so intertwined with mental health. Um, yeah,
Okay.
so
No,
leave
you
it
brought
there.
up you brought up a lot of really good things that I think we're definitely going to touch on, and we have. I took a few notes there. Also, I just want to say for anyone who's watching along, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, both Kelsey and Wayne are open books, and they're willing to answer any questions. Yeah. So just we'll keep it on topic though. I see there's a question about Bell's palsy. I don't think this is the appropriate. Facebook Live for that, so I won't be able to answer that question for you. So let's talk a little bit. You talked about the difference between Indigenous identities and then Indigenous realities, and so I want to talk a bit. And Kelsey, you brought this up about I in our pre green room discussion, I think that's what it's called, the tech term. I don't know what it is. I'm not in film. But like about how Indigenous identities are defined or can be defined in Canada specifically by people who are not Indigenous. And so, like, the Indian Act is something that Wayne brought up and he mentioned earlier. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit and how it can actually affect people and their feeling and their sense of like community, identity, belonging. Or there's a lot of different things tied into this. What are your thoughts on that, Kelsey?
Yeah, I think the how the Indigenous identity has been defined when it's defined by government or non-Indigenous people has been the source of a lot of my sadness, but also my anxiety. So for me personally, I walked into a friendship center for the first time when I was 18. And I actually started as a placement student because I wanted to do the work to be a part of community. At this point, I'm still putting together the pieces. There's lots of missing people in my family. There's still lots of questions about, you know, where we're exactly from. And then so I just remember doing the work and sitting down and, you know, kind of eating it. Sometimes I say something and it,
Yeah.
this is what it means to be a part of community. This is what it means to, not make a name for yourself, but this is a way that you're brought in because a lot of folks, it's hard to trust you when you just come in and you just, drop a random nation and it's just kind of like cool. Um, extend on that, right? So I I was I have status, but I only receive status. And by the way, this is by no means makes you that is not the Indigenous identity. This is another example
Yeah.
of the Canadian government defining our identity and assigning us numbers because that's essentially what it was. They're afraid of us and they wanted to make sure they could count us. So fun fact. I I wasn't even able to get status until 2017 in an amendment in the Indian Act because my grandmother married a non-Indigenous person.
Okay.
My grandfather is French. So my grandmother is the one who is Indigenous and my dad is the one who is Indigenous, and that has come down to me. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned is that doesn't really matter. What matters is what I've gone through in my life. What matters is watching, my father go through the struggles with his identity, the struggles with, just not knowing how to fit in or how to even talk about his identity because he doesn't have the tools. And it almost was anxiety ridden for him to talk about it. And it kind of transferred onto me. So when we have a lot of non-Indigenous people, and this has been happening since colonization, defining who we are, we get a lot of comments about like, I'm sure lots of people can relate to being like, well, you don't look Indigenous, right? And it's just a white person, and I'm like, what? Okay, thanks for your opinion. Like, I don't know how to respond to that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's I think that's messed me up for a long time in my life, and I think it took me a while to really understand that is confusion, and that was meant to be. That was done on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the initial thing was that the original idea is that we wouldn't be around based on what has happened to us. So, and yeah, I'll pass it to Wayne to extend on that.
Yeah. Wayne.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely echo a lot of things there. I think when we're talking about Indigenous identity, people bring up aspects like blood quantum. How Indian are you? Um, that is a hard question to answer. I mean, that really doesn't explain whether or not you've had the Indigenous experience.
Yeah.
It might be whether or not you present as Indigenous. I got my cousins back in Ontario, and they're very light skinned. You know, uh, they refer to themselves as they're the Findians because they're half Finnish, half Indigenous, but present very white, blonde hair, blue eyes. But they're practicing ceremony. They have direct ties to residential school, 60 Scoop. They are living the Indigenous experience more than most people I know. Well, we not present that way.
Yeah.
Um, so it's really tough. And then you also have people, and like, I get it. I come from a beautiful culture, a beautiful language with beautiful customs, and we'll meet somebody who, like, yeah, I'm connected to that. I have an ancestor 400 years ago. who is from your community. And this is not in any way to attack or challenge those people, because why wouldn't you want to celebrate this beautiful culture that I'm from?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you want to connect with it? But if your ancestors 400 years ago, did they have the indigenous experience? Were they around after 1890s, the creation of Canada, the creation of the Indian Act, residential school system, um, forcing First Nations people under reserves, which are really open air prisons? It's a total different relationship with that. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about reconciliation, we are not reconciling because I come from a beautiful culture, language, community. We're reconciling because the Canadian government over the last 200 years has attacked that community,
Yeah.
has tried to perpetuate a genocide on that community. That's what we're reconciling.
Yeah.
So somebody whose ancestor was hundreds of years ago, they're not reconciling for that experience. They're reconciling specifically for that experience of genocide perpetuated on the indigenous community. And I think again, this you might ask, how does that connect with mental health? How could it not?
Yeah.
How could it not? I mean, there has been so much studies around the effects of genocide on communities, what intergenerational trauma looks like, how that presents, how you literally have blood memories of a genocide committed on your communities. How just by the fact of being indigenous, you're going to have those responses, and a lot of times it will present in a way that comes out in mental health.
Yeah. So
It's easy to like.
yeah, I kind of want to touch on that because that was one of the things that is I guess it's most prominent for me is this idea of intergenerational trauma and how that can affect people, and that kind of answers to what you're saying about people who are like, oh well, 7 skips in my generation ago in my lineage is when there's someone who was native or indigenous, and they didn't, and then after that, it's like, okay, they married a white person, and then they married a white person, and so now here I am, and I have like no actual relation to this lived experience that these communities have gone through. So what are some like, I mean, and for people who don't know who are watching, like what are some of the real life I guess I don't want to say consequences of like intergenerational trauma and how it plays itself out in today's time. I know I can think of a few that I can like point off the top of my head that we'll get into in a little bit if you guys don't talk about it. But there's definitely a couple things that I know that are direct, like a direct dissension of intergenerational trauma. So either of you, whoever wants to go first, I'm interested in hear what you think about it or what you've got to say.
Kelsey, do you want to?
Sure, yeah,
I
of
can jump in
course.
too.
Yeah. For me, I think the biggest thing I've experienced is the inability to show love, the inability to say, I love you, right? That I think very much is a direct impact from residential schools. And I can't speak for everyone, of course, but I can speak for my family. There is this sense of tough love in the sense, and like that is as good as it gets. Like there's not hugging, like it's not something that is, it's almost just kind of like I am this person, and like, you know, maybe you can just assume that I love you. I'm not going to say it, I'm not going to show it. It's just like, I'm your dad, I'm your mom, etc. And I think that that was the biggest thing that when you can kind of see people kind of like freeze up like a board when something comes up that is uncomfortable. I think that this is what I've experienced a lot, particularly with my father, who is Indigenous. And, this is something that's different now. We've kind of explored topics like this. We've not really had this conversation, but I think it's one of those things where, for example, my father didn't grow up with information on residential school, correct? So he's like, I think learning about that had helped him and also helped myself kind of realize some of the habits that I have, those internalized, emotions and habits, I guess you could say too, that came from, our ancestors or living relatives, depending on who you are, who were stolen away from their communities, who were taught that their language was like some sort of demon language. They're taught that, they can be saved as long as they're no longer Indians. And they weren't treated with any love. They were, in some residential schools, we know they were locked in closets for days if they were caught speaking their language, if they were caught drumming. So I think that that's like one of the things that sticks out for me when we're talking about this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wayne?
I can't talk about intergenerational trauma without talking about Claire. Claire is my dad's biological mother. Claire is somebody I didn't meet until later on in my life because my dad was removed from her custody, grew up in another Indigenous family that had a lot of physical and sexual violence. So when I met Claire, I knew she was the one that first hurt my dad. She was the source of a lot of his pain, and he would talk about, because he had met Claire before me, and we've asked him like, why don't you want to find out who your real dad is? And his response is always the same. I found out who my real mom was, and that was painful enough. Why would I do this again? When I met Claire, literally the first memory I have of her is her calling me ugly, and telling me to shut up. And from that point on, I'm like, this is the meanest, evilest person I have ever met in my life. And I'm not gonna lie, when she died, this was many years later, I was happy. I'm like, this is somebody who personified everything evil I could imagine. Claire had a lot of children. A lot of them were adopted out. Some stayed with her. Some had really, really tough lives. I'm thinking about my Uncle Reg. My Uncle Reg is a huge beast of a man, biker, one of the toughest guys I know. And he actually helped me on my journey to understanding who I am and who Claire was, because on September 30th, early mid 2000s, I saw him put up a picture on his Facebook being like, I wear an orange shirt today because my mom went to a residential school. I was never told Claire went to a residential school. I was never, Uncle Reg, this huge monster of a man who never talks about any emotion, who's just the tough guy. He recognized that something, because of his mother's experience, may have led to the experience he felt. This is the definition of intergenerational trauma. I did not go to a residential school. My grandmother did. I learned the experience that she went through. She went to Spanish in Espanola in Northern Ontario, a notorious residential school where the amounts of physical and sexual violence were some of the worst in the country. And it reframed, Claire grew up removed from her family, went to a place where statistically it's almost certain she was physically and sexually abused. What we know about my dad is he was possibly a cop in Elliott Lake. Knowing the vulnerabilities of Claire, that relationship probably wasn't the healthiest. And then, she had my father, she had other children, and she never knew how to love herself, having experienced that amount of pain as a child, and then wasn't able to love my father the way he'd want to be loved. And my father had issues loving me the way he wanted to be loved. So when Kelsey was talking about that idea of like hard to show love, I felt that. It disassociated me from my family. And, I've gotten to a place where I've forgiven Claire. I wish I could have the opportunity again to have those conversations. I never did. Instead, all I saw was the pain. All I saw the pain she felt and the pain she inflicted, and never asked myself, what was her experience? And I think we do that a lot with Indigenous peoples. We might see a barrier being presented, and we might be like, oh, Indigenous peoples have this, that, or that issue. But we never ask what went into that. And again, this is where the land acknowledgement comes in. If you're just going to acknowledge pain has happened without then saying, oh, so this happened in the community, and this is why we might be seeing these outcomes. And maybe this is our fault as settlers because we perpetuated this pain on this community for our benefit. And if all we're going to do is say we're going to acknowledge it, how do we move on from there?
So I I want to talk a bit about. So you've brought up residential schools a bit, and obviously it's like a horrific part of the history of Canada. It's like I grew up in the States, and it's a very different experience. It's a different Indigenous experience there than it is in Canada. I grew up in South Florida, where when I learned about the Indigenous peoples of South Florida, they were like warriors, straight up, like they fought to the end, and like that was the like experience that I learned, and which is different, I think, than what people are learning here in Canada about the Indigenous experience. And so like when I hear about residential schools, and then I see like for me, it's a very direct link between residential schools, people being taken from their communities, and then the disproportionate number of homeless people in the city, and disproportionate amount of suicides in Native communities, and mental illness, and just all these things being stacked up. What kind of comments do you guys have about, like, I want to like kind of touch on homelessness
Mhm.
in general, because I think that's like it's a direct tie for me, and maybe it's not. For me, I see it's like point A to point B, straight line there for me. Do you guys have any comments about that?
I mean, I can share my experience again. I know I've been sharing a lot. Growing up, we grew up poor. We grew up like sub poor. Like we grew up where the poor families are like, oh, at least we're not Wayne's family, because that must be really hard. We grew up in like this substandard housing. We would be evicted several times a year. So at one point, it was almost two schools per school year. And it also meant that we would travel across Ontario. We'd spend 8 months in Hamilton, 6 months Sault Ste. Marie, 3 months Thunder Bay, a few months on my community. When things got really bad, we'd all be sent to live with relatives. I was always sent to live with my other grandmother, Adele, who was one of the closest people to me. But we also spent days where there were months living in a tent in somebody's backyard. And only now I'm like, we were homeless. We were homeless as a family. And then there came the period where I was 15 and I would fight with my family a lot, and I was really ashamed of being so poor. So at one point, I'm like, I'm going to leave. And I thought I was like empowering myself and like, I'm going to go out on my own. I was a 15-year-old child living on my own. I was homeless. And for me, that was a step up from living in the family that I lived with. So I think when you're seeing barriers like that, and I don't think my story is so unusual, that this is just something our community experiences because we've been removed from our ability to be human in a lot of ways. It's been beaten out of us through uh, the genocide committed upon us.
Kelsey, do you have
Absolutely.
any comments?
I do in a way. So I've never been homeless, so I don't want to speak about it at that angle because I don't really have a right to. But what I will say is that actually Wayne and I know each other through working at a shelter for Indigenous folk.
Okay.
Um, and one thing that I can really comment on that is that we were never meant to have the same playing field. We were never meant to have, you know, the luxuries or the same shot at life as a lot of folks because it was almost just like not this is the system in which we're in doesn't really favor us, right? This is a white colonial country. Sorry, it became a white colonial country. This is not a white colonial country. Let me correct that. But the systems put in place, I mean, dare I say it, we live in Quebec. If you look at the people who are making decisions for us, a bunch of old white people, right? So they don't know our realities. They go to like a Indigenous history conference, and then they think they're like, oh, okay, like I think I understand. They always want like a badge or a certificate. I used to be a trainer, that's why I'm talking about this. They always want a certificate to go, I did Indigenous training. And I'm like, this doesn't stop here. Like, oh, like you opened a can of worms that clearly you didn't know what you were getting into. But congratulations, now you're in it with us.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole thing. Um, and even to speak to the self that Montreal has an Indigenous homeless shelter,
Yeah.
right? It's because
Yeah.
the need is there. So there's obviously the systems put in place that just they're not in our favor. And what that's actually what Wayne and I work towards dismantling.
Yeah.
So we do have a fair shot.
Excellent. So this is just a comment. It's not necessarily a question, but it's Perla saying that in Canada as a youngster, 55. I don't know if that means 55 years ago or if either way, but we learned nothing good about Indigenous peoples only since the Oka crisis and meeting a few Native students as a Concordia student, and I could feel the mental health struggle through the substance abuse. Yeah, I mean that's just like that's the realities of like I'm assuming Perla is a white Canadian, so but either way, but that's like that's what we're
Indigenous
taught.
Canadian. I did not learn about Indigenous peoples.
Yeah,
My journey to understand Indigenous peoples was my own journey. It was
yeah,
my own experiences. You know, in school, we weren't taught anything. In school, I was asked if my community, the sun stayed up 24 hours.
yeah.
My community is just more western and only slightly more north than the city I was in. I'm like, how could they be so ignorant
Yeah, they don't have
when
no
we're
idea.
so
They just
close?
literally know nothing.
Uh, and you know,
Yeah,
it was an experience. You know, you were either put on the spot and answering questions that I had no knowledge of. But yeah, you know, I do Indigenous one-on-ones, so I do these sensitization sessions, and every now and then I'll have some Indigenous people in my groups, and I've learned so much through that because a lot of people are like, oh, you know, Wayne, you didn't talk about this. I'm like, oh shit, that's amazing.
yeah,
But also just as often, like, as an Indigenous person, I was never taught that.
yeah,
And I'm like, you know what? I get you because as an Indigenous person, I wasn't taught these things that I want to share with the groups that I work with.
yeah. I think it's important to acknowledge too that like we can't rely on the state to teach us these things, right? When I moved to Canada, I moved here in 2003. One of the very first things I learned about Montreal was about the Oka crisis, and I immediately dived into that and about watched like Alanis Obomsawin's Rocks at Whiskey Trench and 375 Years of Resistance, and I made it a point to like go out and try to educate myself from the source and from people that live this experience rather than relying on the institutions of Concordia, where I was going to school, to tell me about these things. Because A, I knew it wasn't going to be real. And B, I was just like, how in the world can they tell me what these people are experiencing from their ivory tower? And so I think that that's where we have to take the onus on ourselves to educate ourselves, right? Like, I am not expecting to know everything, but I'm also not ignorant of things because I'm choosing to engage with these things, engage with communities in different ways that maybe exceed what is normal. I don't know. But like I just think that's an important thing to say is that if people are curious, you need to ask. You need to educate yourself. You need to read books. You need to watch films. You need to like talk to people.
And you know, Tony, I think you're bringing up something really important here, and it's something I think we talked about a bit in the green room. So
Yeah.
I'd also want to get Kelsey's take on this. It's whose role is it to inform people, and also whose role is it to do that work?
Yeah.
So we had a earlier conversation about being Indigenous peoples, both working with Indigenous
Yeah.
institutions, but also working in non-Indigenous institutions, what that experience is like and what it looks like. So yeah, I don't know if we wanted to,
Yeah,
Kelsey,
that's
if you want to
you know
share your
it's great
experience.
because there's actually a question in the comments about that experience, and
Mm,
I'm gonna bring that up when we get talking about it. So yeah, Kelsey, I'd love
okay.
to hear. It's great. This is a perfect like we're flowing nicely into what we wanted to talk about. So Kelsey, yeah, let's hear your experience with this too, so we can make sure we get everybody's voices.
Yeah, absolutely. Working in post-secondary, you definitely get a lot of really interesting questions, but you also like you get some people that just have some audacity sometimes. Like there are some of my coworkers that have stories of like professors, and like I'm not going to say the university, but this is a well-known university who come and they say, "I need you
All
to
of
do
them.
this." Yeah, yeah. Who are we kidding? Yeah, and it's like I need you to put this together for me, and you know, we're a student service.
Yeah,
We're an Indigenous student service. We're this is not what we're meant for. We're not even meant for professors. We're meant for Indigenous students.
yeah,
Um, and it's just one of those things where I think people are very confused. They look at us and they're like, "Wow, okay, you're here, get to work,"
yeah,
and it's almost like sometimes they want our opinion, but they just want us to sit at the table. They just want us to do the hard labor for them. So again, they can say, we're working towards, diversifying. That is the word I heard way too much. We're trying to be equitable, right? So it's like, okay, cool. So you just call me into this meeting. We have meetings to discuss discuss more meetings, and then when the final project comes, you didn't implement anything that we said. You just had us at the table. You just wanted us there to say that we were there so that you could be like, it's, Kelsey approved. Do you know her? She's blank at the university. And it's embarrassing. It makes me just not want to go to those meetings. It makes me just wonder why some of our roles exist. And so when we push, and so I'll give you an example of it, just how we're invited to the table. When something happens to us, they're like, oh, that's your problem. Incident at the university that I work at, we had to fight so hard to have a sign just outside of our building so people even know that we're Indigenous Student Services. Someone comes by, they have written Indigenous Studies, someone spray paints, who cares? So we go to the university and we're like, hey, someone vandalized our sign. And they're like, oh, well, you have a budget to fix it. Yeah, this is a real story. I'll let you show up at the university, but yeah, and it goes like they don't actually care about us when we actually need something. Yeah. They're just there to be like, oh look, like we got Kelsey, she's Mi'kmaq, yeah, she knows everything, and I'm like, I don't know, like I don't want to be that person, And then so yeah, like it's sometimes even in Indigenous spaces, maybe I can flip back to this as well. Yeah. Being an Indigenous person in an Indigenous space. Sometimes we kind of forget ourselves within sometimes a very complicated identity that we're allowed to have different opinions. We have different customs. We come from different places, and just because you learned this doesn't mean that this is what I learned. Yeah. So, for example, I mentioned I'm Mi'kmaq. I'm a member of Listugush First Nation. I've never been there. I'm a Torontonian. I grew up, I grew up away from all of that. So I actually I take what I need from different cultures in which I've been living in, Ojibwe being the main one. So even for me, when folks are like, oh, what is this take on this? Like, and it's like story time all of a sudden. And I'm just like, I don't know. I'd have to talk to someone about that. And all of a sudden it's just kind of like, oh. I'm not what you were expecting. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, Wayne.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to talk about, and I want to be a bit cognizant of time and my own ability to ramble on. And but a few key points. I have been in the field I've been in for 20 years, over 20 years now. The first almost 15 years of my career, I did not want to work with the Indigenous community. I was a younger worker. I didn't understand boundaries. I was also somebody with lived experience, and just seeing myself reflected in the community I served, I was not a strong enough worker to do that. Since I've been here in Montreal for the last 8 years, I specifically work with urban Indigenous organizations. So now I have a different experience. Now I'm completely representing the community that I served. And, I'm working with a lot of people in leadership, and they're all saying things. We want more people to represent the communities we serve. So we want to hire more Indigenous staff members. But then they're not making space for what that entails. When I go into work and I'm seeing somebody who reminds me of my uncle, I'm seeing Claire in some of the participants I work with. I now have a lot of experience. I feel like I'm a strong worker. That still affects me. That's still, me as somebody who's had this long career in the field, I still get traumatized by that. We're hiring very young Indigenous workers coming in, putting them in a space that could traumatize them with each and every interaction, not giving the space to explore what it means to do that, and not having those supports in there. And we also have a lot of non-Indigenous people in leadership roles. You get this whole, and I didn't want to go off too much on this, but like this idea of the settler ally who comes in, takes up space in organizations, will advocate for hiring Indigenous peoples, will advocate for the need for higher wages, and then never do the work to step away And a lot of times they're like, well, if there was a Indigenous person that could replace me, I would leave, without realizing them not leaving means an Indigenous person can't go there, or they don't believe Indigenous communities have that ability to have those leadership roles, which at the end of the day is white supremacy. If you don't believe that the Indigenous community can lead the Indigenous community, you're not an ally anymore. You're somebody profiting off the genocide of Indigenous peoples. So yeah, there's so many issues working in the community, even if you're represented in it. And if there's not a space for that mental health, so that vicarious trauma that every Indigenous person working in the Indigenous community will face, you're doing a disservice to the community. So I think there needs to be that understanding um, from employers that when you're hiring people that have that lived experience, there's also going to be that vicarious trauma that happens, and you need space to work with that.
So this is actually what the question is about, and it's perfect timing. So Nat is saying, and this is, I think, a question that can work for both of you. I know you provided training to police in the wake of the Val d'Or crisis. How do you preserve your mental health when you do such important activist work? And I think that this is a like, how do you take care of your own mental health? Like, what are some of the things that you do, both of you, in your different scenarios, in your different situations, do to make sure that you're taking care of yourself? Because at the end of the day, you are experiencing these things, you are experiencing the tokenistic things, you are not getting the support you need. So how are you supporting yourself and making sure that you can do that? And hopefully there's some people who are watching that are in managerial positions and ownership positions that can take this to kind of like impact their policies, and this is get people talking about what's needed for people who are experiencing these things. So maybe Kelsey, you can go, even though this original question was to Wayne. I'll let him, he's talking a lot, so
I am talking a lot.
It's fine, it's just now it's Kelsey's turn.
Totally. I used to work for an organization called the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Center, where I was a trainer. And what we did is we had like 4 series of trainings. The first one being like Indigenous histories, going into sort of like the paradox of what is Indigenous sovereignty. Like, is it sovereignty if it's defined by the Constitution? Bit of a funny thing, and multiple subjects. There, I think that I like to say, like, I've heard it all. I've seen it all. I've felt it all. And there's been moments, I feel like sometimes I was halfway through a training and I'm just like, I kind of want to cry. Like, I kind of just want to be like, I'm going to call it out because I doubt anyone's on the phone call, or on this call, but Thunder Bay, I was in Thunder Bay. I was doing a training with the literally people who work in hospitals, people who are responsible for making sure that people are well. And I don't even know what I was talking about. I think I was talking about like where the friendship centers were. And this man raises his hand and he's just like, tell me why I should care. Oof. And I was like, I didn't even start yet.
Yeah.
That's I don't know. I don't, and my coworker, my co-trainer at the time was actually non-Indigenous, and she just jumped in. She was just like, oh, nope. Because she could just tell that like part of me was like, okay. And then part of me was just like, I could feel the blood rushing to my face. I was just like, how dare you, right? This is why you're here. You just answered your own question. And then what I do is I keep people who support me and challenge me close. There's going to be times where maybe I say something stupid. Sometimes I say something like, very privileged as, someone who's a white presenting Indigenous person. It happens all the time. We have to check each other. We have to do it constructively. And we need to remind each other at the end of the day that we're all out for our betterment, and that those people, they're going to have a hard time navigating this, but we hope that they find that moment, right? And sorry, I don't want to also go too long, but I also had a moment as a trainer where this man was a janitorial staff. I think it was Fort Francis. And he came in like, oh, I hate mandatory trainings. Like, why do I care? Yeah. And at the end, he was in tears. And he was like, you know what? I couldn't imagine someone taking my children, because we'd been talking about residential school. And that was his moment. And that's not my responsibility. I was a trainer, obviously. But I always, if anything that I can do in kindness and in spreading information, I do. And I keep the friends close to me that are like, you know what? Keep doing this work. Don't give up. Say when you need to tap out. Tell me when you need help. And those are generally the best allies when we're talking about allyship or being in solidarity with Indigenous people as well.
Mhm.
Wayne?
So, yeah, I'll take a shot at this very specific question. And, a trigger warning, my answer is probably not going to be that great. So the question
That's,
is how I preserved my
yeah,
mental health. I didn't.
yeah,
I talked earlier about being bipolar. 2006 was the last major depression, mania that I had. Ended up me being hospitalized on several occasions. Um, since then, I've been a director of youth services. I've held many supervisory managerial positions, developing program. Like to think I was thought of as a bit of a steward of some communities because of my role, age, experience. In 2018, again, was hospitalized many times, both suicidal ideation and attempts. Um, Even though I hadn't had experiences at that point 14 years, when it came back really hard. And a lot of that was the vicarious trauma of working with this community and taking on the work that I did. Having my mom pass away in that same year, having a medical incident, come up 12 years later, losing space and community because I couldn't both take care of myself and do the job that I was doing. Um, so all of this sort of like, yeah, at the end of the day, I was somebody who was experiencing very severe mental health issues that led again to many hospitalizations. Led to one of the hardest years of my life, and it was a challenge. And only now, several years later, I feel like I'm able to go back in the community to do that work again. I'm very thankful that I have an amazing personal support network. I have psychiatric help, I have therapeutic help, and I've gotten to the point where I can talk about what I've experienced. I can talk about, you know, I I love doing the Indigenous 101s, but a part of it is very therapeutic for me. It's exploring how my identity has led to the experiences that I've had, and how I can use those kind of stories to share again what intergenerational trauma looks like.
That was a great
So,
answer, Whitney.
yeah. I think that was a really good answer.
is
I
it?
don't. Yeah, yeah. I
Well,
think
a
that's
sad
really good.
estimate, I
Like,
mean, it was a very tough period.
yeah,
I'm still living it,
yeah.
yeah, it's something
But I
that
think I think you gave concrete examples of how you are taking care of yourself and how even giving this the you said the Indigenous 101s are like they're a way of soothing yourself and like helping you work through things. And I think that's like those are valid forms of self care, right? Like if teaching and helping other people learn about something is what helps you feel good, then that's a valid form of self care, like
yeah.
entirely. Anyways, so I think it would be irresponsible to be talking about Indigenous realities and mental health and not bring up missing and murdered Indigenous women and how that impacts the Indigenous community as a whole. I don't have stats, but they're alarming. Maybe you guys know them off the top of your head. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I know it's like staggering. Do you guys have any insight, any opinions, things you want to say about it? Because I mean, it's definitely something that it affects your communities as a whole. So,
Did you want to start, Kelsey? Yeah, I mean,
Go for it, Wayne.
yeah,
so I mean, this is the reality of Indigenous peoples. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is a very gendered issue. What we're seeing is in the outcomes, the way it presents. It presents in my missing cousins. It presents in a lot of Indigenous women who are victims of intimate violence. It presents in this idea we have of trafficking is you know the Liam Neeson idea doesn't exist. It's Indigenous women that are being trafficked in a Canadian context. It is my grandmother, so it's not Claire, it's Adele, my mom's mother, who was murdered when I was a child, and like my closest support. It's me. It is my, huge challenges forming intimate relationships with women. Like it is missing murdered Indigenous women plays out in every facet of an Indigenous person's life. Um, I don't know if you want to jump in. I mean, I can give more like specific examples, but what we know is that this is a crisis that is ongoing,
Yeah.
that the mechanisms that have been brought out to address them have not been working, and that we need to keep moving forward. We need to really address this and look at it as the crisis that it is and how it affects the entire Indigenous community.
Yeah, and maybe I'll jump in as someone who is Indigenous and who is a cis female. One thing I'll point out, and forgive me if this is kind of like not exactly what you're asking, but it's one of those things. I've had several times in my life where, you know, a man comes up to me, you know, on the street. Every woman can probably talk of an experience like this, and it's just like, oh, you look exotic. Like you look like there's something, you know, like your skin's, you know, pretty pale, but like what's, you know, and I'm always just like really like awkwarded out. Like exotic's the wrong word.
Yeah.
You are exotic.
Yeah.
And it just becomes immediately sexualized sometimes when I reveal that I'm, you know, a Mi'kmaq woman. And it's just kind of like, oh, and then all of these stereotypes flow, right? Like this, like the goddess of the earth and like this, like that spiritual person that's that idea of the Indigenous woman. And this is but one facet of this. And for me, like my dad raised me to be a little thug in public. Like someone comes up to me, you know, I'm 5'2", but I just like I scared, you know, like I used to be on the, you know, the metro system in Toronto. My dad would be like, chin up, even if you're scared, chin up. Don't let them mess with you. I almost swore. I'm so sorry. I was like, I can't.
Earlier. I don't know if anyone heard it, but I definitely swore earlier, and it's the first time in all of these that I've ever sworn.
Yeah. And so this, and again, maybe not to like talk about myself too much, but one of the things I will say is that it is a double whammy in some ways in our society to be a woman and to be Indigenous, because a lot of people don't respect us, right? Like, and the issues when, you know, people are looking at Indigenous women, like it's almost like they equate to like a lower than like a white woman, you know, and maybe not, it's not even almost, it is in a lot of instances. So then it becomes this thing where I think that they prey upon us. They prey upon Indigenous women. And it's one of those things that we talk about a lot, but what is going on? It's everyone's issue. And it was like trendy at first, and I hate to say that, but I want to make a point here. When Trudeau comes into, you know, Parliament, and he has this whole commission, and then I know people who are on the commission, not personally and very well, but it was almost just kind of like, what are we doing here? People started dropping off because it's not actual work. This work is everyone's work, asking questions. Why is this happening? People just want Indigenous women to take on the emotional burden and be like, oh, this is why. This is what we should do. That's not the case. That's not how it's going to be solved.
Nope, it's not.
At all.
Wayne, you got anything else to add, or?
You know, I just, again, if we're going back to our subject, again, know that trauma is faced by the entire community. It's a very gendered issue that is definitely affecting our women, our daughters, our sisters, our, you know, our community, but that pain is felt throughout the community. And how do you address that without looking at how, again, all these aspects of colonialism that have been used against Indigenous peoples are playing out in a mental safety, in a sense of having protective factors there, and how we're addressing that. Quick before, like, I know we're ending soon, is, you know, this idea of resilience.
Yeah.
Every time I do a talk, they're like, Wayne, you're so resilient. The Indigenous community is so resilient. Look at all the horrible things that have happened to you, and you're still here. I hate resilience. Stop horrible things from happening in Indigenous communities. Stop glorifying the fact that we survived a lot of pain. Let's just stop the pain. Yeah. Let's make our focus not to be celebrating, oh my God, these communities live through so much. Let's just stop the pain that's being caused.
Just stop enacting the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, resilience is a valuable thing, but it's also not something that should be, like you're saying, it should be celebrated. Yes, it should be celebrated in the person because they're resilient, but it shouldn't be celebrated as a community as a whole. It should not. People shouldn't have to be resilient.
A
in that
land
way.
acknowledgement is just talking about the resilience.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a solution. And again, hey, it's great that we're resilient. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't as resilient as I am, you know. But let's talk about the underlying causes of this pain and what we can do to heal from it.
So this has been a great discussion. I want to thank you both so much for joining me tonight and just talking about this. Do you guys have any parting words? Anything, last things you'd like to like end with? I want Wayne to go first, so that way Kelsey can have the final word.
Absolutely. So do I. I talk a lot. I'm sorry.
I think it's
Shay McGuetch for having me. I've enjoyed this talk. I think it's talks that we need to have in more spaces. And you know, Tony, keep up the good work. Kelsey, is always lovely to speak with you and share these conversations in front of a camera instead of the way we usually do.
sitting
So
around a
thank you. Thank you for
park.
having me.
Yeah. Well, everyone who is watching, thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for trusting me enough to do this. I hope what I said was helpful. I hope it wasn't ranty. I have a really bad habit of just like, I'm going to say this. This is going to be so awesome in my head. And then I say it and I'm like, I don't know if people should invite me to these things, but I hope that this was good. I had fun and I'm really happy to be here. So.
No, so this is Tim was just saying earlier with that your authentic voice is welcome, specifically when you're saying, oh, I don't want to talk about myself too much. And I think that's like, I think that's a really good, I think that's a great way of like kind of ending this, is that like you both spoke from your own lived experiences, and I think that that's the most important part of this series, is for people to just like talk. I really appreciate you both being here. I cannot express that enough. This topic is something that I feel very strongly about, and so I have a hard time getting my words out in a way that I don't want to just like rant and rave and yell and scream and curse and swear and just like all these things that like, because it's something that I feel so strongly about. I don't want to like mess it up, I guess you could say. So yeah, thank you very much for speaking and saying everything that you have. And thank you everyone for tuning in and watching and being here, and for the questions that were asked and everything. And have a good night, and we will see you next time. I can't remember what the next topic is, but we'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.